Thank you. I apologize. Anytime you're ready.
When you look at the field of MRDD from the perspective of a legislative, historical perspective, the major legislation that really set the cornerstone for Ohio's system today was passed in 1967, was Senate Bill 169. And in essence, it created for each of our counties a county board of mental retardation and developmental disabilities, a non-paid volunteer board, and the ability, with the support of the county commissioners, to have the ability to pass local funding for the services. And this was the direct result of a significant lobbying effort on the part of parents, especially with the support of the ARC of Ohio. And in the early days, after the counties then became organized, the focus of services became the educational system, because many times individuals had been precluded from a public school educational system. Now, certainly not in every case, but certainly across Ohio, that was the experience, and that was rather than the exception. And that legislation then became the groundwork for the funding, which is the cornerstone of today's county board programs. Since then, there's been several significant pieces of state and federal legislation. For example, two pieces of federal legislation really helped put things in perspective. 1973, the 1973 Rehabilitation Act put in place the concept of accessible services, accessible facilities, and non-discriminatory hiring practices for people with disabilities of all types. That, coupled with, about a year later, the federal legislation on public education and the requirements from IEP, moved the system forward dramatically and put in place the expectation that, for example, public schools were to serve all the public's kids. And in the case of kids with a special need, put in a requirement for an individualized plan. There's certainly been many, many pieces of legislation that have enhanced the system over time, and I certainly don't remember every piece of it, but some examples. We're proud, since I've been director, of the Senate Bill 171, which created the Abuser Registry, which we now have about 68 people on that, because of they betrayed their trust, whether it was abuse, neglect, or theft, are now precluded by state law from serving people and being employed in the MRDD field. There's also been additional state legislation. I mean, we've been fortunate enough in the last 5.5 years to pass about 8 pieces of legislation, including two pieces on major reform in Medicaid that have been the subject of trying to refinance our system to serve and expand the services, but to do so while being compliant with Medicaid, which has been a challenge. And it's not been resolved yet. We've also reformed licensure in the last year with Senate Bill 191, and how we now have a better way to delegate nursing in group homes in how we serve people. So the legislative history, and there's obviously more to it than that, and has helped, whether it's at the state or the federal level, has helped protect the rights. And then you couple that with some of the major court cases, which are important, put in place the context for how we serve people today in Ohio.
I think one of the most intriguing things to me is the DD Bill of Rights, because it seems like in all the civil rights movement, and I know a lot of people, when we've done this taping, have referred to what we're talking about as a civil rights movement, and even Mark said this was really a civil rights movement. And in any of those civil rights movements, I don't recall anything where a particular group of people had to have a specific act, a bill passed to guarantee them the most basic rights. Can you tell us just go into what the DD Bill of Rights is and what some of those rights were for people that, that some of the things we took for granted that those people would have the right to?
Well, when Ohio passed what became known as the DD Bill of Rights, it was in response to the how the state had gone about closing the Orient State Institute. And several of our state legislators, including I think it was then Senator Hobson, were instrumental with conducting public hearings into what had happened And out of that, it became the recognition that we needed to protect the rights and do so in a more formal way. And the Bill of Rights, which still is in existence today and is still the cornerstone of services, and in fact affects our system and the public education system, guarantees things that maybe they shouldn't have to guarantee, but because we've had so many examples of where the rights weren't protected. So, for example, the Bill of Rights has in there, certainly provisions on the right to be in the community setting, the right to due process requirements, the right to religious freedom, and various things like that, and that we still hold dear. And of course, the cornerstone is freedom from abuse, neglect, and exploitation that have been refined and defined more clearly over time, including the bill we passed about a year ago, the Victims of Crime Task Force. It became a piece of legislation that we think will help protect, again, the rights of people and help ensure more prosecutions of people that violate those rights. But to us, they're very important. Like the civil rights movement, sometimes we do need legislation to protect what should be what we would believe to be rights that don't need that kind of protection, but unfortunately sometimes do until they become part of the mainstream thinking of our society.
And was the DD Bill of Rights just in Ohio? Is there something similar across the nation that you're aware of, or was this particular to Ohio?
I don't know. Good question.
I don't know that either.
I'm not certain, and I don't want to guess. Not when I'm being on tape.
Right.
I don't want to.
I wasn't ever really clear whether it was something that was in Ohio. Law.
No, the DD Bill of Rights is Ohio. I'm trying to think, and I know the tape's running, but you're going to edit this out. I don't think there is if there is a piece of federal legislation that's known as a Bill of Rights, I don't know it. So we'll go to another question.
Well, going back, what do you think? And I think you already talked a little bit about it. The role of the families, especially the older families that had people in institutions and all. What was their role in bringing us to where we are now? Both, with the services we have and the safeguards that we have through legislation.
When we ask ourselves how's our system in Ohio and across the country moved from where it was to where it is, I think any conversation that fails to give full credit to the role of advocates, be they family members, a brother or sister, or self-advocates, misses the boat. Beginning with the creation of the Arc of Ohio in Cincinnati, about 52 years ago, I think if it wasn't for our families, if it wasn't for people challenging the status quo or the prevalent thought, we would not have made the progress. And I think that in the years since then, more and more individuals that have an interest in the field have become advocates have helped that too. But I think in the beginning, it was parents who were questioning why is public policy such that it requires me to be putting my child in an institution? Why does public policy not let me have the right to an education in my neighborhood school? Why should I go to a church basement? And to be told you can be excluded because you, quote, can't learn is a terrible concept. So families in Ohio and I think across the country did the major bulk of the advocacy effort that not only created county boards of MR and DD, but created the environment and the culture. And I think when I look at the change agent that occurred, I think it was the perfect storm of advocacy between the Vietnam War and our massive challenging of public policy, coupled with the civil rights movement, and again, challenging prevalent public policy, not saying law, but the way things were, and then the same questions being asked of people in the by the disability community. Why are we institutionalizing people? Why are we sterilizing people? Why are we not looking at community settings like we would for everybody else? And I think that the families took the leadership role in challenging the status quo, and of course, that was tough. And in many cases, the families went beyond that, put their money where their mouth was, paid for services in church basements because public schools excluded kids. And that was, in fact, the law in Ohio at one point in time. So I think the role of families, probably today, they're trying to find what their new mission is because we've now gone to a more professional system of advocates, of residential services. But you can never forget the fact that on an individual basis, the protections we have for an individual, man or woman, son or daughter, child or adult, should come from the perspective of people that care, be they family members, a sibling, brother, sister, aunt or uncle, nephew or niece, or somebody that simply is involved in somebody else's life. And that, I think, is critical.
What do you think, if you had to look at it from your perspective, has probably been the most important federal change, whether it was through a court case or legislation, and what's maybe the most important for how Ohio's system is developed?
Well, if you look at what has moved our system forward, it has to be a combination of selected court cases coupled with selected legislation. As an example, in Ohio, clearly the paradigm shift began with the creation of county boards of MRDD. So, and the paradigm shift was the value at the local level of having a focus and an emphasis and the ability to fund those services with the support of local communities by millage being voted through a levy process. There has been again many federal laws, 1973 Rehabilitation Act, the IDEA, or previously Public School 94-142, Public Law 94-142, and some of the other Ohio legislation about protection and safeguards. But on the other hand, without the intervening court cases to interpret it, the court cases sometimes prompted the legislation. For example, in the case of Public Law 94-142, right, so the Education of All the Handicapped Children's Act, it was precipitated by several court cases, especially and notably one in Pennsylvania. And the federal government realized we're going to have a hodgepodge of court decisions ruling on the rights of kids to an education if we didn't put together a more consistent federal law. There's also been, for example, more recently, the Olmstead case that talked about the right of a person with their consent and with their permission or support of the professionals in the field to not be necessarily kept in an institution. And that case came out of, I think, was Georgia. And there have been, so court cases and the avenue of the courts is critical, not only in individual rights violations, but in major paradigm shifts.
Do you see court cases as one of the primary instigators in the closing of institutions in the days of Orient and those things? The court cases that came about, were they instrumental in that?
When one looks at at what has happened in public policy for institutions across the country, some of the cases that really come to mind have resulted in forcing our society to look at past practices that were not maybe the best. For example, the most famous case, or one of them, is the Pennhurst case out of Pennsylvania about the institution at Pennhurst. But Ohio has a Barbara C. case that did the same thing. And sometimes if you can't move public policy one way, you try to move it another way. And one would hope we wouldn't have to always have a court case to see enlightened and good public policy. But frankly, if it doesn't work another way, then you have to look at what makes sense. So you would hope, and I think we are in a different place, so fortunately we may not need as many cases. But, that's an important avenue if you can't get the legislation of the public to do the right thing.
Mark and I talked a little bit about the concept of dignity of risk and how that fed into the way services are being delivered and will be delivered. And I remember another one of those principles or concepts when all those years ago when we were working, it was one called the principle of normalization. Can you give us a little of the background of that and what you think the history of that was, and if it's still applicable today.
In our field, we hear phrases like normalization and dignity of risk, and I see them a little different. The normalization concept actually came out of a number of MRDD leaders in the institutional environment. And I'm sorry, let's start that again. And I could hear those background noise. One phrase that I hear mentioned, and I certainly did when I got into the field a number of years ago, was normalization. And then we hear newer phrases like dignity of risk, and then there's others that have a meaning in the MRDD field that might be different than elsewhere. In the early days of MR, we're talking about the 60s and 70s. There were a number of individuals in public or private institutions of higher learning. Wolfensberger and Burton Blatt as two examples of the key leading edge thinking at that point in time that gave us a concept of normalization, which meant to them then something that was today most of us look at, well, of course, but back then it was cutting edge thinking, and normalization back then meant that we should try to put people with disabilities into as normal like a lifestyle and environment as possible. So it's not normal to be in an institution. It's not normal to be in an educational system that's apart from regular education. It's not normal to travel with 50 of your closest friends, or in fact, never to travel and never leave the institution. So the normalization principle that came about was a recognition that systems that were serving people needed to try to make their life as normal, like whatever normal means for you and I, for all of us. But as you do that, and as you take people out of, quote, protected environments that have their own issues, you bring to play how much risk can you give a person, or can you tolerate with people who have disabilities? And what if they make bad decisions? And can you let them make a decision that could hurt them? And of course, then you have to weigh how much hurt and what the harm is. But the dignity of risk means, without certainly putting a person out of place of being injured or doing things that are bad to their health or their well-being, that it's okay to fail, because that's the risk we all take. So you try a job and it doesn't work and you get fired. Well, that's part of life. So if you never want to get fired, then you never take a job. And I think that for people with disabilities, I know my wife and I felt this way. Our daughter needed to be in a normalized environment to the extent that she could deal with it, and it would be beneficial to her. And I think that's true for most of us. I mean, not everybody goes to Harvard. And I think the issue for us is, as a society, is looking upon people with disabilities and helping them get to as we call, their potential. And I'm not sure we ever get to anybody's real potential. But for all of us, it's what makes life normal for us and with the most potential, knowing there's going to be risk. And the two play together, but you don't put one at abnormal risk of something happening. But certainly as you move people back into their communities, they do have the same events occur that occur to most people in life.
Maybe we can talk for just a couple of minutes about some of the things that we worked together on for so many years, and seems like there shouldn't be an issue, but there still is some of the struggles with the getting homes in the community, and the various things that we had to do to get those homes in the community, and thinking now how resident home has still had a struggle just to get a new home open. Mm-hmm. And you think maybe that's over and all, but can you go back in those years of trying to get homes opened in communities, and the old NIMBY syndrome, and where even the kindest of people would say, well, yeah, I agree they should be here, but it shouldn't be on my street or something, and the difficulties with zoning and those mm-hmm. kind of things.
When we look at the principle of normalization and dignity of risk, one of the things that comes into play immediately is where a person lives. And certainly it's been a problem in the past. it is a problem today, and it'll probably be a problem into the future, is where we locate, whether it's a group home for 4 or 5 people or an apartment complex unit or something like that, is how well is that accepted in the neighborhood, and how good a neighbor does a group home become, or the individuals living in a home. Certainly, if society saw people being institutionalized and as a matter of policy for years and years and years, when you then try to say, no, that was wrong, we want to put people, or that was not the best approach, we want to put people in community settings, you have to explain to the communities, why is there such a change in policy? Part of that is education, part of that's time, and part of that is the fear that we all have about things we don't understand. So if a person never lived with us, they didn't grow up with our neighbors, they didn't go to the neighborhood school, they were always segregated, always isolated, you almost in the back of your mind have an assumption there must be some reason for that, other than it was public policy. So the struggle for us is, as we said people should live in neighborhoods, and there were many families that never institutionalized their son or daughter. And I think, I haven't mentioned much about that. But when those parents wanted group homes for their son or daughter, because like everybody else, they didn't want their son or daughter living home forever. And that isn't the normal way people develop. Because at a certain point, you do grow up and you move out of your family home. It became a challenge, especially when it's a group home in neighborhoods. The fear this brings property values down. There'll be too many staff in my street. The fear, well, will these people do something to harm me? And aren't they better cared for elsewhere? I mean, there's a lot of issues. Some are prejudicial, some are lack of knowledge. But every home is a separate struggle, and has been for many, many years in many states. There have been a number of housing changes in federal legislation that now give as a right of entitlement. You don't need to go through zoning requirements, because there was a time when local zoning jurisdictions banned certain groups of people from living that had needs to live together, like people with disabilities, but they're not alone. And those have been taken out of by federal law now. You do not, as a matter of recourse, have to get 4 or less living together. You don't get permission anymore. But you still have to educate the neighborhood. It still is a struggle on a case-by-case basis. Even if you rent an apartment in one building unit in an apartment, the other neighbors will say, what does this mean? And I think we as professionals have to explain to people up front. I know that can cause problems. We have to be honest with people while we advocate for the person that needs a house like they do. The irony is, in virtually every case, after you've gotten over, and it's sometimes very difficult, the anger, the 50 or 100 people coming to a zoning meeting or something trying to oppose something, or a group home, and maybe even some of the other things that have occurred or do occur. Our experience has been, after a while, the home settles into the community and you would know it's there. Doesn't mean there can't be problems, but the research now shows home values do not lessen if there's a group home in the neighborhood. We don't see 10 times more traffic in a neighborhood. We don't have everybody's home vandalized by the residents. We just don't see the things that became the fear of neighborhoods. But I'm very grateful public policy was changed by some of the housing requirements that took away the right of people to challenge who should move into my community. So I think these things are all helpful. But every time you open up a home, 4-bed or 5 or 10, whatever it is, you do have people say, what does this mean? What's this going to do? But on the other hand, I don't think any of us would want to have our neighbors take a vote, should we be allowed to move in? And I know, having been a parent of a child with disability myself, I would not be comfortable having other neighbors decide whether she's allowed to have a home or not in a neighborhood, or do I have to put her in an isolated farmhouse somewhere? I don't think that's right. So I feel very strong about the fact that people need to live together. On the other hand, folks that are doing the developing of housing, I think of an obligation that we don't put people in homes that could put other people at risk. That's the other side of the coin.
If we go back, and in such a really short span of time, in a historical, if you're looking at it historically, and the things that you've been involved in, what's the journey been like for you in watching coming into a system when it still was segregated, when people were still in institutions, and being there when they were coming home from the institutions, and being there when children started leaving segregated schools and going to mainstream schools, and when there were people living in a community. What's that journey as a professional for you been like, and as a person, what's that been like for you, for watching such a short span of time, really, those changes?
When you sit back and look at the change that's occurred in our field, it's been extremely dynamic. And in context, although sometimes it felt slow, historically it's been remarkable. We have gone from a society less than 100 years ago, I mean even 60 years ago, institutionalization would have been the norm for people, to today where we've had actors portraying a person with disability win Academy Awards. And that's remarkable. And we've had the concept change in all aspects of life like that. And I was lucky. I came into the field at a point where my first teaching job and my first teaching jobs were in public school settings with kids with special needs. Now, in one case, it turned out I got the storage closet. And I didn't realize that. I knew it was a pretty small classroom until I saw the blueprint one day for the school that had just been built and opened, and it said storage closet in my classroom. Then I realized, well, this is interesting. But even that being said, the school gave me the resources to buy textbooks, and the kids, although they were in a segregated class, they were at least in the right school. Today, we even see, taking that example further now, some of our junior community colleges offer the opportunity for people with disabilities now to attend some classes and to learn at a higher education level. And certainly we've gone out of our way now to help people with special needs achieve in advanced education and learning. When I came to Montgomery County and took my job, the county had a fairly strong community program. And families, the paradigm had already shifted when I got in the field in Ohio now, where families were primarily being served at home. They did go to the segregated county board school program for the most part. They did go to the workshop. But even those two have shifted. I know Montgomery County and most county boards do not have a school program. Their kids are now mainstream back into public schools, and many counties provide supports to allow the person to be successful in a public school setting. At the same time, Montgomery County and other counties across the state have pushed and emphasized not only getting people out of workshops into jobs, but letting people with disabilities even own businesses, which would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. But we have a movement called micro enterprises where people with disabilities can, in fact, get business loans and start businesses now that enhance their ability to earn money with their talents or their resources. And that kind of entrepreneurship for our field wouldn't have been conceivable 60, 70 years ago. And I'm not saying it wouldn't be conceivable for everybody, but in the mainstream, whether it's Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, whatever the state was, it wasn't the way they think. I think Ohio is on the cutting edge when you talk to other states of where we're trying to go. And we're not there yet. We have a lot to do. But I think there's enough people now that value things like self-determination, supporting people in small residential settings, listening to what people want in their life and need in their life. And it's just exciting, and it's been able to be watched in a generation which wasn't the case with other things like the civil rights movement that have been very big 100-year struggles, and we're still maybe not where we need to be in every case. So in some ways we've been fortunate that our paradigm shift and our struggles were compressed into an employment generation for a person like myself that started, and we had a lot of kids in the school program in 3 buildings. To when I left, there weren't any, and not that everything was perfect in the public school, but the schools were supporting and accepting these individuals and trying to do the best they could to serve them. So I mean, it's exciting to see what's happened. Because I think we've seen so much change in our field, and I really attribute a lot of it to the leadership of President Kennedy. because he had a sister, Rosemarie, with a disability. And I think that perspective and what he did with creating the President's Panel and their recommendations, said it was okay to talk about something that had been kind of kept in the closet. I mean, how many years ago was it that some families literally kept a child or with a disability in the closet because they were embarrassed? So I think we've really turned a corner, and I'm excited about what happens in the future. I think we still have things to worry about what we're doing with our workshop setting and whether that's still appropriate for everybody. I'll begin with I'm excited about the future, and then you can see how it. I'm really excited about what I see happening in the future. I think it's going to be even compressed more so because I think the issue of individual value and individual rights is well established. I think the leadership of counties and families and individuals, self-advocates, People First of Ohio, have moved us to the point where we can't backslide. And I think it's wonderful if we can give people economic independence so that those people that can make decisions can make them, and those people that can earn a living should be enabled to and be taxpayers like everybody else. I think and I see those things happening quicker and quicker now, sooner and sooner. I think people are now saying we may be moving too slow for some people. So that's good to be on the side of feeling you could move faster. But I think we have a bright future. There's still going to be problems. There's always going to be issues. Not everybody's going to agree. But I think it's exciting where we're going. And I think when I look down the road, I see the role of county boards really changing to being one of enabling individuals to have self-determined or independent lives with supports that keep them independent. Because we all know when you're in institution settings, and I don't mean institution in the sense of a facility, but it could be an institution of any type, you really do, whether you realize or not, take away the rights and the ability of individuals to do what's meaningful to them.
I want to go back for just a second. When you talked about the Kennedys and their sister, and how quickly things have happened in the MRD field, and that history, and how big a change we made in such a short span of time, really. I've always thought, too, that, that situation with the president coming in at that particular time and Willowbrook were, if those hadn't happened,
Burton Blatton.
If those two things hadn't happened, if we still wouldn't be where we were in the 60s before the changes happened. Do you see that as really pivotal in really making something historic happen, the change happen? I mean, where would we have been if there had not been those two elements?
When I think back on what might have been the factors that triggered such a significant paradigm shift in how we viewed people that were different, the things that strike me, and there's just a handful, and I'm sure there's some that I'm not going to remember, but some of the things that strike me was certainly the role of President Kennedy. Here you had a president who, for the first time, talked about mental retardation, and before he died, received a report from the President's Panel on mental retardation that, by the way, even though it's evolved, is still in existence today, that sent a message of how we serving people. You then had thinkers of the time like Burton Black.
Just start with
Burton Black?
B-L-A-T-T.
Blatt. That's right. Okay. You certainly had thinkers of the time in public and private higher education like Burton Blatt, Wolfensberger, and others, Kirk and Johnson, who then philosophically talked about the normalization and other concepts of how we serve people, and started educating people in their graduate programs and saying, there's more to this, there's more to life. You then had some of the court cases, like in the early 70s in Pennsylvania, about the right of a child to an educational program. And all those things, then some Supreme Court cases, like especially more recently the Olmstead case, but there's cases earlier than that, that also, even if they weren't directly in mental retardation or in mental health or other areas, put in place the rights concept, or some of the civil rights cases that, again, Civil Rights Act put in place voting issues for people with disabilities. It's all those pieces coming together. And again, the middle of that is the individual and their family, and how they then took up the lead through the Arc of Ohio and the Arc of the United States and advocated, lobbied, and a number of those families are certainly still with us and remember what it was like and don't want us to go back to the days when some were counseled, don't bring your child home from the hospital. I mean, in just my generation, families were not being counseled again to not bring their child home unless with some medically requirement otherwise. Just being mentally retarded was not not an issue. So I think those things did it. Now, if they wouldn't have occurred, well, we probably wouldn't have had the civil rights movement. I mean, society would have lost other things because I think they were a natural outgrowth. If I'm a parent at that time period and I'm questioning some of the things I'm seeing but not feeling I have power to move them, and then I watch the civil rights movement take place and how difficult that was, watch the Vietnam War protests, and again, how it changed public policy, it leads one to believe we can make the same kind of an impact in this field. Then you have the book that Burton Blatt published called Christmas in Purgatory. That was the film expose, so to speak, of conditions in an institution. And as long as we didn't know those things occurred, we were fine as a society. You see those things occurring, and how can you not react to them? No different than watching the TV today and seeing somebody die in a foreign country and saying, "My gosh, we got to do something." And it's the same concept. And I think it would have happened regardless. I think this, in a sense, things aligned, and they were going to happen. And I feel I've been fortunate enough to see so many of those occur.
I think I'll just kind of wrap up, and then if Mark has any questions or anything else. Do you think the younger parents today, the parents that have not known the struggle, and just having a child with a disability is a struggle, but not knowing that struggle that came with being told that your only option is let the child die or go to an institution and to fight for every piece of ground that you had to get. Do you think there's some kind of a debt or something that this generation owes to the generation that just preceded them that made things possible for where they are, or at least a recognition, something?
When you look at each succeeding generation, and do they appreciate what the generation did before, the answer is probably no. And unless somebody helps us along and it reminds us, we do take for granted that here we are today and we don't know where we came from. And I think Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, summarizes how you've got to focus on what some group of people did that moved us forward as a country or as a society. And I think that certainly the families in the 40s and 50s that said, my son or daughter staying with me, were pioneers. And probably endured things that we, thank goodness, didn't have to endure because they did endure them. No different than the first person that crossed the picket line to go to a restaurant when they were told they were the wrong color or the wrong race or the wrong religion. Somebody has to do that so that you and I enjoy the benefit of that. And I don't think we do thank them. I think we just kind of accept that and don't realize that, no, we don't want to stop where they were, but we have to be in a place to understand that if they wouldn't have done that, somebody else would have had to, maybe us. And I think those paradigm shifts are always occurring. Whether it's our field or another field, they're always the pioneer, the person has to take the risk, the person who gets sometimes harmed from taking the risk, so that we can enjoy and then push forward from there to a new paradigm and a new value system. And I know we don't probably thank them enough, and we don't even appreciate what they did sometimes. Nowadays, it's common practice that every parent would bring their child with a disability home from a hospital. You wouldn't even have a doctor suggest, probably, other than if there's a medical requirement, not to. But I can't imagine what it would be like to have been asked as a parent, maybe you shouldn't bring your child home, just pretend they died. And to say no, and the struggles and conflicts you would have had if your minister or priest would have been the one also saying that to you. So yeah, it's, you have to remember, but you can't make that, you can't dwell on that. You have to respect and thank those for what they did, because you're the pioneer for the future services also. So each group or each generation builds on the framework or the starting point of the one before them.
Mark, you have
No, I don't.
anything that we haven't touched on, or anything that you've thought about that you'd like to include?
Yeah, Judy, I'm gonna take you up on that. And if you want to edit this out, you can do that. I think one of the things that when we look back on what was past practice, and it's very, very easy to criticize it. Yeah, we shouldn't have done it. It's terrible to do this. I mean, maybe it wasn't meant for me to do this.
Not a problem.
We're going to finish up here and let you back to your normal routine.
Anytime.
When we look back on how services were, whether it was 5 years ago or 50 years ago, it's also easy to criticize that generation for what they didn't do or didn't know that we think is obvious today. And one of the areas that I'm a little sensitive to is the area of the institutions, because sometimes they take a bad rap when in their time period they were created. In fact, the early institutions in the 1850s and 1880s that came out of Europe, at least the concept, and evolved in America, actually had a pretty noble purpose. The philosophy initially was to bring a person who had special needs together in one place, work with them, and return them to the community. That was the actual purpose of institutions. They evolved, of course, from there into a long-term living situation, because you weren't going to cure the problem. If they were mentally retarded, I don't mean it was a problem, but if they were mentally retarded, you weren't going to cure it and make it go away. It's not like an illness. So we created institutions as a first response, other than the family dealing with them by themselves. We thought they were going to be here to serve an in and outgoing population that became a long-term care population. And then we didn't fund them properly. And then over time, we cut their funds. I'm talking about 20, 50 years ago. And then we wondered what they evolved into when we didn't value the workforce. We put them, in many cases, out of sight and out of mind. If you look at most institutions in most states, they were isolated. They were self-contained, their own power plants, their own farmland, and thousands of acres. And they weren't funded properly. They evolved into something we're not happy with, we weren't happy with. And sometimes, like Ohio had a major court case from one of its facilities because of lack of care.
Just start there with risky cancer.
Can't believe people actually call here.
Yeah, imagine that.
I don't know what's going on.
Okay. Ohio first.
Okay. Ohio, when you had a major court case on the lack of care for people in one of its institutions, that resulted in Ohio coming up to speed where they should be with services for people in that kind of a setting. And one thing I'd like to just kind of put in place, institutions weren't good or bad initially. They were probably a good idea 100 years ago. It's what you do as society evolves over time, and it's how you try to change systems. And although today we're not enamored of them like we were 100 years ago, they served at a point in time, they were the only way to serve people. And if we wouldn't have had them, we may have found that we had a history of genocide of some sort with this population, like some of the other countries that didn't serve them in some way. So although today we look upon them differently, and we would look at disdain of a 3,000 bed facility, they had a role to play, they tried to play it, and then they were never funded properly, whether they're publicly operated or privately operated. And it put them in a no-win situation and guaranteed they couldn't move forward.